We always talk about readiness on this show, but we never talk about the 1 in 3 women and the 1 in 5 men that struggle with eating disorder in the military. But today, we're going to break that silence. Today, I've got Leah Stiles, the founder and director of SEAWAVES. Welcome to the show, Leah.
Hi, thank you for having me. I'm excited to have this conversation today.
Yes, it's very exciting. I think a lot of our viewers are very interested in this topic because it's a topic that's not generally talked about and it's easily stigmatized. So, Leah, can you just kind of give us an introduction to who you are, a little bit about your Navy service, and what sparked you in your personal journey to starting SEAWAVES?
Hi, sure, absolutely. So I feel like I served in multiple different ways over the span of 20 years. I served myself active duty and retired as a Navy senior chief. I also served as a Navy spouse. My husband and I retired the very same day after meeting in a school right after boot camp. So I served alongside him as a spouse, and now we've passed the torch and our son is active duty in the Navy. And so I've served as a Navy mom as well. And so I definitely got to experience the military wearing those three different hats. And uniquely, I went through that entire journey also battling an eating disorder. I battled an eating disorder for 30 years. And I had my eating disorder before I joined the Navy. I had my eating disorder when I was 11 years old. I just thought that I was fine or recovered and ready for the next chapter. But I wasn't prepared for really the breeding ground that the military, that layer of the perfect storm that happens in the military that really continues to agitate and aggravate eating disorders.
Yeah, so it sounds like your personal journey is what sparked this whole thing. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. I knew coming into the military, I was already what I call eating disorder informed. And I got a really interesting perspective because, like I said, my husband and I, our first day of A school, we were stationed at Fort Meade, Maryland. And our first day was 9/11. And I really got to see a shift in perspective around post-traumatic stress and how we talked about it and how we looked at it and the stigma around it. How at that time we thought that it was the generation before us. And I really got to see a shift that leaders began to learn about it, peers began to recognize it and know how to help support or get to resources. And I really always hoped that eating disorders were going to be right behind that in the conversation. Um, I I feel from my experience, I feel that the military is probably a good 10 years behind the civilians when talking about eating disorders as a mental health illness.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. It sounds like, we're in the Midwest. That sounds like the phenomenon with the West Coast meeting to the Central America here. But tell me now, with your shared experience with eating disorders, how has that shaped the way you lead SEAWAVES, your organization?
Yes, so I created Sea Waves to really fill the gaps in knowledge, care, resources, the things that I experienced through my own service. So a little bit more about, how eating disorders played a role in my service. For the first 10 years, I was extremely silent and secretive about it. I didn't want anybody to know. I didn't want it to impact my life or career, even though crazy thing is, something that I was using as control and coping was also quickly out of control and running me and my life. And um, so for those first 10 years, I secretly wished that other people would say something or do something. I knew that it had to be done. But at around my 10-year mark, I was selected to Chief Petty Officer. And this was such a juxtaposition time in my life. Number one, that's such an honor, and especially that to have it that early in your career. And in the Navy, you go through 6 weeks of induction or initiation or the season. It changes names all the time, right? But you go through that 6 weeks of training period. And ironically, this was also a very low point in my life. So I got to see this throughout my service. Like the worst I was in my eating disorder, the better I showed up on the outside and in person and in serving. Those those values that make me terrible in my eating disorder made me great as a leader and a sailor. Things like perfectionism, discipline, um, you know, order and control. Those are, it does great on one side and terrible things to the other side. And so during that period when I was learning to be a chief petty officer, and from before the sun would rise to after the sun would set each day, and sometimes even into the next day, I was surrounded by senior leadership, the senior chiefs, master chiefs, senior leadership, just pouring all of their information and wisdom and knowledge into, in my group there was 42 of us. And nowhere in any of that conversation, even in the mental health conversations, were eating disorders. And it was also at a point where I was very low in my eating disorder and needed help. And I would look for ways to ask, and to feel it out and to save conversation to see if anybody was able or prepared or could hold space for that kind of issue. And I didn't find anybody. Ironically, it was just a few months after that that I ended up rupturing my esophagus from purging so much. And that was kind of when things started to unravel. My command found out about it, of course, even though I tried to go to the civilian hospital so that it wouldn't get in my record, but it still got back to the command. And it was interesting because, I look back over the 30 years that I had an eating disorder, and I would say about 50% of the time, I truly wanted help. I wanted somebody to ask me questions. I wanted somebody to find out, to be intrusive. I wanted support. I wanted resources. But the thing about eating disorders is there's that other side of it too, that other 50% of the time where I wanted to keep it hidden, private, keep it to myself, my own personal thing. I didn't think it was impacting anybody else. I didn't think it was affecting anybody else. But at this time, I had worked for that commanding officer for 3 years, and I was actually selected as his Sailor of the Year those 3 consecutive years working for him. So I knew he knew my work ethic. I knew he knew me as a leader and as a sailor. So I found myself almost relieved that he found out about it. And when I got informed that the CO wanted to see me when I got back from the hospital, I was almost looking forward to his help and support. But when I got to his office and I knocked on the door and I went to enter, as I did normally at most mornings, instead of sitting on the couch to talk, he instead stood me at attention in front of his desk, and he told me, "There's no place in my Navy for you."
Oh my gosh. Wow. Brutal.
It was brutal. And I'm not mad. I'm not mad. I still respect him a lot. I just know that he didn't know what he didn't know. And that's what I find so often in these conversations, Dave, is most of them end up with, "I didn't know that," or "I didn't think about it that way," or "I didn't realize it." And so he was kind of looking at it as a disciplinary issue, even though my career up to that point showed it wasn't a disciplinary issue, it was a mental health issue. But there's so much, as you started off this conversation with, there's so much misinformation and stigma and taboo. So I ended up having to fight and get lawyers and representation, and I fought to stay in, and I won. And it, that was actually a dangerous point for me, because I learned at that point that I really had to keep my eating disorder more of a secret.
A lot of things you said there resonate with me, and probably the viewers too, especially that juxtaposition about what makes you good makes you bad, what makes you bad makes you good, as far as performance goes, and everything that goes into particularly any mental health disorder, but specifically eating disorders. And then I find it, even more interesting, because I know that it's been an issue for me, and I know several patients and clients that I see, when it comes to, it's easier, sometimes it feels easier to be discovered than to be vulnerable and ask for help and say, "Hey, I think I need help. I have a problem." And it sounds like you fell victim to that too.
I did. And to tie it back to, why did I wish a place like SEAWAVES existed back then? Because then I would go independently and try to find these kind of resources on my own. I would go to all the standard places that we see support given for mental and behavioral health. Um, and it was like a deer in the headlights when I would bring up eating disorders, and I would fall short most of the time. I actually, I ended up getting a therapist on base, and she wanted to help, but she had never been formally trained on eating disorders. And so we would start our weekly therapy off with her Googling how to treat eating disorders. Um, and so now research shows us that most providers do not receive more than 15 minutes of formal education on this mental health issue. And eating disorders have the second highest mortality rate of all mental health illnesses. And yet our providers are not trained on this.
Yeah, I can say from personal anecdotal experience, as a physician going through medical school, it was maybe a half-day module where we learned about eating disorders, anorexia, bulimia, body dysmorphia, and that's about it.
Right. Well, I'm glad that you got the half day. That's more than a lot of people are getting. And it is such a layered, it's such a layered thing, right? There's so many layers to it. There's a lot of updates about it. There's a lot of comprehensive things that go along with it. And then we get a lot of misinformation from the media. A lot of people, their idea of eating disorders kind of stems back from the Lifetime channel or the 90s talk show hosts and what we saw there. Of course, we know a lot of body dysmorphia is impacted by today's media on all different levels, but yeah, it was really difficult to find providers and resources that were eating disorder informed. And so when I retired and I started doing the research, and I was like, if for me as a senior chief, it was that difficult to get that level of care to where I almost died a couple different times, um, then who else is out there? And so I started doing the research on my own. We did find that the 1/3 of females and 1/5 of males are struggling with this. Somewhere between 9 and 12% actually receive a diagnosis. That number is pretty low because, of course, there's no screenings in place for this. It is very low, but it makes sense. There's so many career repercussions and stigma around it that people aren't getting screened, which means they're not getting diagnosed. But I ended up under the guidance of my mentor, ironically, the same command master chief that had held an intervention for me and medevaced me back from deployment off the aircraft carrier. I spoke with that same mentor when I retired, and I was trying to find my purpose, and I knew that things were broken, and I love finding solutions for things.
Got to fix it.
So when I retired, I realized that the system was broken. I realized that if I, as a senior chief, had so much difficulty accessing resources and care and support, that there was many others out there. And then through my experience, I was able to see this in my peers and those that I had led. And I was talking to my mentor. Ironically, it was the same guy, the same command master chief that had held an intervention on me a few years earlier and had me medevaced off of deployment, off of the aircraft carrier and back to the States. And I had said, it's broken and I want to fix it and I don't know how. And he kind of called me out, and like any good mentor should. And he said, Leah, you're never really going to be able to make a difference as long as this is still secretive for you. You're still holding this and trying to hide it. And there were so many people in my life that still didn't know. And so, out of a little bit of spite and a little bit of wine combination, I took to social media and I told my story. I went on LinkedIn and Instagram and Facebook, and I told everybody at once, I've had an eating disorder for over 30 years. I'm sorry for hiding and lying. And I just really ripped the Band-Aid off. And what came from that was almost honestly, like a movement. And people started reaching out to me and telling me their own story or the story of somebody they know or care about. And they would say, oh, I recognize that in my shipmate or my sister or my loved one. And they were just so brave in confiding their stories in me and with me. And I found that all those stories kind of started leading the same way. of, okay, I finally have admitted this, but now what? Now what? And and I didn't have a good now what answer. I had looked so many times and come up short. So I created SEAWAVES to fill that now what answer.
Wow. I mean, so what you did is, first of all, an amazing testimony, an amazing personal story and journey. What you did is a lot of people struggle with, right? You turned a self-perceived weakness and you leveraged it into a testimony, and a powerful testimony at that, to help others. So let's talk. I want to go and drive this into like the meat and potatoes of this conversation about SEAWAVES. So SEAWAVES, from my understanding, it's an acronym, right? Can you kind of tell us about what it stands for, why you chose it, and how that drives your mission forward?
Yes, exactly. That's usually the first question as people say, why sea waves? Is it because you were in the Navy and it's nautical? And I say partially, because in the Navy, we love acronyms. And so every single letter in sea waves really does stand for that gap that we're filling, that hole that I've acknowledged, through my lived experience. So the S is for support. So it's support, education, awareness, wellness, advocacy, validation for eating disorders and suicide prevention. So the S for support is resources and referrals. We connect the military community, so active duty, veterans, family members, even caretakers. We connect the military community to the existing civilian eating disorder resources that we vetted and that we work with. And this is everything from an online virtual support group to inpatient eating disorder treatment, and we walk through them on that journey. And we try to remove any hurdles and barriers that might pop up, such as financial obligations, navigating insurance, things like that. The E for education, we developed a program called MEDAL. It's the Military Eating Disorder Awareness and Literacy. And this is eating disorders 101 in the military community. What is it? What does it look like? How does it show up? And of course, what's the role that you can play and resources that are available? The awareness is the important part. For the first time in 2025, SEAWAVES now has a research and data team. And so we've been able to pull a lot of the numbers and data and statistics that were previously missing up until the past couple of years. The wellness is so important. This is where we align with other whole health initiatives. We partner with other veteran service organizations in the wellness space. And, anybody that comes to SEAWAVES looking for support, we make sure that they have access to any kind of wellness modality that fits for them. Everything from equine therapists to music therapy to medical marijuana and cannabis support, self-care, all of those things. The advocacy piece is really important. We had a good win. We got the SERVE Act passed into law in 2023, and this is really going to expand some of that care. Yes. However, Dave, the SERVE Act has not yet been implemented by the Department of Defense. So we do a lot of advocacy. I do a lot of trips to DC and meeting with, change makers and members of legislation to get the SERVE Act passed. Not passed, implemented, that the criteria implemented into the current plans and policies. And then, of course, validation. We talked about how there's so many people struggling with this, but they may not have access to a diagnosis. And so we let everybody know that this is real. And if you have a struggle with food or your body, then you deserve support and resources and care. And then, of course, eating disorders is the heart of what we do. Of the 45,000 veteran service organizations that exist, we're actually the only one specifically for eating disorders in the military community. And then suicide prevention is the last one. A lot of people don't realize that the number one cause of death for eating disorders is suicide. And so one thing I always say is, we meet people, veterans, we come from all different branches. Some of us were active duty, some of us were National Guard. There's such a variety in veterans and where we come from. We're such a melting pot. And and we make fun of each other and each other's branches, like we're siblings. Like, we can do that, right? Other people can't, but we can do that. But one thing I find in every room with every single veteran that we are united with is that we are sick of this 22 a day. We want to get after that number. We are done losing people to suicide, all of us. And so it's so important that when we're getting after that 22 a day, and bringing that number down, that we have got to have eating disorders at those conversations, at those tables, because it's impacting 1/3 of females and 1/5 of males.
I mean, is incredibly true fact, right? 22 a day. It's one of our big missions here, one of our big pillars. And, reality is we've lost more soldiers post GWAT to suicide than we did in the entire GWAT era. And I think a lot of, the national media and the conversation is driven behind PTSD, combat-related PTSD. But reality is it's the gamut. It's so wide. And that people forget that eating disorders is a big driver of that too. So I'm glad that your organization is really highlighting that. So, I mean, your mission is very broad and you somehow keep it clear and focused. Could you, highlight some of your programs, some of the big ones that you are really proud of, that, and just talk about that so our viewers can learn a little more about what you're doing?
Yes, absolutely. So the first and foremost program, and we just had a really big team meeting on this, on how to scale it, is the MEDAL training program. There's been such a demand for it. As I said, it was originally created for military leadership. And then when it got passed in the SERV Act that military leadership, it's mandatory for them to have eating disorder training and education, but there was no place for them to get it. So again, we're filling that gap with the MEDAL program. But then we found that there's so many other places that want it. We found the dietitians at the different VAs want this education. We found that the other veteran-facing service organizations want this information. So we started training like Wounded Warrior Project and collaborating with the Face the Fight Coalition, and expanding that training, because we know education saves lives. We know prevention saves lives. So the MEDAL program is one of our main programs that has also spawned into other webinars. We have one coming up next week, suicide prevention webinar that explains the tie with eating disorders. We have seen that jump. We have over 100 people registered for that one already, and the demand for that. So that's the number one program for education. And then the second program that we run is the Lighthouse Project. And this has different levels of ways to get involved through community, camaraderie, and connection, because we know that saves lives as well.
Oh, wow. So are you able to share maybe one success story that stands out of someone you helped and, how you impacted their life?
There was one in particular, a young lady. Her name is Anna, and she was 15, and her father was deployed, and her mother went with her to a regular pediatric appointment. And at the pediatric appointment, they weighed her. Her weight had dropped significantly from the previous appointment, and they went to go take her blood, and she passed out. And when they were able to get her labs back, they realized she was severely anorexic. They put her immediately into the hospital, and they refused to discharge her back to her mother until she was in a higher level of care. Well, there was no place that accepted TRICARE for a higher level of care that she could go to. So she went day after day, just desperate and crying, and the father was deployed. And she ended up telling me a story that she went into the chapel and she started screaming at God in the chapel and said, "Please send me somebody, send me a person, send me a sign." And when she walked out of the chapel, there was a nurse there with a SEAWAVES flyer and handed it to her. And she called me, and we were able to get Anna into treatment the next day. And this was last year. And as of right now, Anna is 100% on her healing and recovery journey. She's weight restored, extremely healthy, back into high school, and doing really well.
Leah, one of the big things I see through my work at Xterra Health and the Xterra Health Foundation, where we do veteran disability services, we are always working with veterans to try to help them get service connected for disabilities, whether that's physical, mental health, or eating disorders. One of the big barriers we face is, I mean, no shock. I mean, in the military, it's a culture of don't ask, don't tell. Don't go to sick call. You don't want to get labeled. So how, with SEAWAVES, is there anything you could tell a service member, a family of a service member, what they need to do or what they should do when it comes to maybe getting things properly documented in service? That way, when it comes to applying for benefits, they don't get that denial.
That's a really good question. And we do know that you want to always have everything documented. When we look back over our service, it's a blur. Whether you've done 4 years or 24 years, it ends up a blur. And so you do want things documented. And you also never know when things are going to pop up later that had initially started in your service. So you want all of that in your documentation. That said, as far as eating disorders go, it is extremely difficult to obtain disability for eating disorders. That's part of the advocacy that we're doing, is to get that changed. Right now, there's a large emphasis on weight criteria to get disability, and that's extremely unfortunate because that's part of the myth around eating disorders, that eating disorders have a lot to do with weight or food. And that's just symptomatic. In fact, less than 6% of those with an eating disorder ever fall into the underweight category. And so that makes it extremely difficult, because to get disability, that right now there's still weight criteria assigned to that. So for somebody like me that had an eating disorder for, over 30 years, had ruptured my esophagus, had been inpatient living on an NG tube for almost 2 years, on death's doorstep, and I got 0%, for my eating disorder. That being said, because there was those levels of documentation, they were able to lump it into PTSD and other mental health things. But specifically for that line item, I got 0%.
Well, I will, give a sliver of hope for maybe someone listening that's maybe questioning, is this something I could apply for? I never was seen for it. I have personally worked with several veterans, both female and male, that were never seen in service, but through, creating the appropriate independent medical opinion, the lay testimony from witnesses, loved ones, their personal testimony, we were able to get them service connected for all sorts of eating disorders. So, what I do want, listeners to hear, maybe that are going through your organization or listening to this podcast, is even if it's not documented in service treatment records, don't give up hope. There is always something you can do in a fight that you can be had to get this hopefully service connected. Now, Leah, for our listeners that are listening, that may be struggling silently, they agree with everything you're saying or what I'm saying, what should they do? How could they learn more about what you're doing? How could they learn how to get involved? Is there resources that you're giving out right now?
Absolutely. So definitely visit our website, sea-waves.org. Specifically, I would say go straight to the resource page. There's lots of information on there for free virtual online support groups, other organizations that we vetted, that we work with. Lots of information there. We work really hard at keeping all of that updated. I would say if you're finding yourself in a moment of a crisis where this is just weighing so heavily on you, we have partnered with Crisis Text Line, and you can text WAVES, WAVES, to 741-741 and be able to reach somebody that's eating disorder informed right away. Although their name is Crisis Text Line, you don't need to be in a crisis to reach out to them. They want to help you before a crisis. So there's definitely that. I would say if you're not in a moment of crisis but wanting to learn more, sign up for one of our webinars, or see if we can bring our medal training to your department or command or wherever you are. And follow along on our socials. SEAWAVES has a really amazing marketing team, and they do a really great job of putting out some hopeful information, some affirmations, as well as lots of education and stigma busting. And so on all of the platforms we do have, it's at SEAWAVES Inc. So follow along with us there even.
Yeah, all the viewers watching, look down in the description. I've dropped the website to SeaWave's website and all the links to their social accounts. So if you guys want to learn more and how you can make an impact, follow that below and start investigating more. So Leah, beyond just veterans and active duty service members, is there a place with your organization or on the website where, say, military leaders, physicians or medical providers or family members can go and learn more about this?
Well, they can go there to learn more about our metal training and then reach out to us for the metal training. And that's where we make a comprehensive program for them. Like we said, we recently trained the adolescent psychiatry unit at one of the Army hospitals. And so we really, we're sure to target more of the adolescent things in that one. When we train active duty commands, we highlight more of the things around, body composition assessment and the way that disorder behaviors show up. We are about to train the crisis text line interns on metal. And so then we give that brief overview. So yeah, metal is definitely the place where you want to go, and reach out to us and let us know the demographic that would be training. And so that comes with me, who's lived experience, and I give it from that leadership side. And then we have a team of people from dietitians to psychiatrists to therapists. And we really just, create the best training experience for the demographic we're reaching.
Fantastic. Well, we're running out of time here, so I kind of want to wrap it up and open up. Is there any last comments or things that maybe you want to plug or introduce that weren't talked about yet?
I would like to bring up that just in the past week or two, I told my story and it got picked up by several of the military publications, military.com and navytimes.com. And that's creating a lot of great conversations. I'm loving to see that. A lot of what we're seeing is this conversation around fit, not fat. And, of course, we want a military that's ready. We want a lethal force. And I think that tagline was short and sweet and it sounded good. But when we really look into it, I want to highlight that the opposite of fat is not fit, and the opposite of fit is not fat. Those are not mutually exclusive from each other. And I highlight that to say that disordered eating and eating disorders can occur in any size body. You can't look at somebody and necessarily be able to tell that they're malnutrition or, struggling mentally. You can't always just look at somebody and tell. And so, like we said, less than 6% of people with an eating disorder fall into the underweight category. So I think through media, we've thought that's what we're looking for to identify an eating disorder is like the size of the body. And that's a myth that I want to put out right now, that eating disorders can occur in any age, gender, background, rank, ethnicity, and any size body. So if I leave you with anything else, I would say that let's make sure that we're being, supportive and kind and inclusive, because you don't know who's struggling.
Thank you so much, Leah, for taking the time out of your day to join us today and share your testimony, share your mission, and what you're trying to do to make an impact. It's fascinating. We're both in two different spaces, but we share a common goal, right? To make sure we're making an impact and making sure people feel recognized and empowered with their healthcare journey. So, for all our viewers out there, I hope you got something out of this. If you're interested to learn more, again, follow those links below. And until next time, stay mission ready.